to the teaching team here at Alethia as kind of an advisor, and then I was already on the schedule for today, and we thought, well, why mess with the schedule at that point in time? So, and we were already planning on coming back, so it kind of worked out. But I'll still kind of stay connected, and I'll talk a little bit more about how cool God is. We're going to talk a lot about how cool God is, and so that's a good place to land when you're preaching, right? Is to make much of God and make little of yourself. So I'm going to keep kind of advising on the teaching team. Obviously, we love this church, but we'll be continuing through prayer. Hopefully, we can get a little card for the missionary table out there with our smiling faces and a little pin in West Jordan. But if you hit like South Jordan, it'll be fine. They're right next to each other. But a little pin in the map, because we really do feel like God has equipped us and sent us out from this church to go be missionaries there, and God kind of used my job, and I guess it was 5 weeks ago-ish, I think, I kind of told that whole story and shared that here from the pulpit. So if you want to hear more about that, or if you missed it, I'm not going to rehash the whole thing. But hi, we're back. Okay, and it's been a crazy 3 weeks, as you can probably imagine, right? Moving from one place where we grew up and where we have this church and to a place where we don't really know anybody. There's a lot happening there. Hi Justin. Why are you standing up? That's awkward. I mean, you can do that like during sing-song time, but no, it's just weird. Sing-song time is not the right term. I'm sorry. So anyway, it's been a tiring kind of last 3 weeks of unpacking and moving and sort of resettling. We did find a happy place, which is an outdoor pool with a high dive. What happened to diving boards in Colorado? Because I don't think I've been off a diving board for like 20 years. And so we've really been enjoying that with our kids. I bought some tight pants because I wanted to feel more hipsterish, so I decided to wear those today. Life's pretty good. But one of the things that we really wanted to do was to not die on the vine. We wanted to find a church very quickly. So before we moved out there, I had been talking to some pastors about, hey, tell me about your church. And one of the things that kind of kept coming up was like, well, I'm sure that you guys are going to do some church shopping, right? And that happened. That was said to me 3 times, and I finally kind of mini snapped on somebody. And I was like, no, we are not church shopping. We're not going to do that because this phrase implies some type of consumeristic mentality, like we're going to go to the church mall and we're going to decide what pair of tight pants to buy. That's not how this whole thing operates, right? We don't shop around for churches. Church does not exist as something to be consumed, right? The church, the bride of Christ, exists for you to serve and give within the kingdom. And so I was like, no. Now maybe you want to find the right church that you can serve and grow the kingdom, but I'm telling you right now, hey, if you came here, I have nothing to gain or lose, because I leave after this again, right? But I'm telling you this right now, this is the heartbeat of the pastors here, right? If you are here because you think that I want to find a church that can fulfill my needs, there is only one who can fill your needs, and it is Christ, and it will not be this church. You will be let down, because man cannot fulfill the needs that are deep down in your soul. But rather, the church can be a place where you can take the gifts and the talents and the stories and the beautiful things of your life, and you can use them to equip and encourage the body and to serve the world. I didn't quite go into that level of detail with this guy. I was pretty fired up about this whole nonsense of church shopping. So we find this church right away, and the guy was like, so you're going to look around? And I was like, no. Because I found out, he says, hey, our church it's kind of weird. It's led by a group of men. It's an elder-led church. We have a teaching team of people. So there's not one pastor. Most people aren't really used to that. And I was like, I'm fairly familiar with this particular situation that you're discussing. He said, yeah, we kind of base our leadership off of this book. It's written by a guy. I don't know if you know the church in Denver. This guy was like, is it Biblical Eldership by Alex Stroud? He's like, yes. I'm like, very familiar with that as well. He goes, we preach through the Bible. I'm like, yeah, man, we're right. I'm right here with you. And so he said, so we just finished up Ephesians. which is kind of crazy because we had just sort of gone through Ephesians, and we're going to be going into 1st and 2nd Samuel. And I was like, are we friends? Like, I felt like Jet Li and the One, like, met, and we're like, the world's going to be destroyed right now if we don't fight this out. But it was kind of cool because we sort of, I feel like the Lord has led us to what I'll call grown-up Alethia. They've been around for 19 years. And it's just been really encouraging to be able to kind of plug in there. So for the last 2 weeks, I've been learning about 1st and 2nd Samuel, which is super exciting because I get to share some of it with you today. And we're going to walk through and kind of do an overview of it. I will point out the awkward part of introducing a study to a book at the church and then not having anything to do with it the rest of the time. So I've talked with Joel a little bit kind of about where the church is going to be going. And so I hope to really set you up well. When Matt Redder was praying for me this morning, kind of like a baton, right? Like, okay, let's pass this off. We're going to do a big kind of overarching view of 1st and 2nd Samuel, who's kind of in it, what's going on, and then we'll talk about some applications sort of at the end. So, to kick this thing off, we're going to do my favorite quasi-Sunday school activity. Now, I learned this in a Bible exposition class through Dallas Theological Seminary, so shout out to Dr. Mark Yarborough. And we've done it before, but I find it a really helpful tool for me to remember how the Bible's put together, and I affectionately refer to it as the biblical literary genre clappy time game. Do you guys remember doing this? Okay. Does anybody remember it so well that you want to come lead it? Do you guys know? Anyone? No? No? That's fine. Don't worry about it. We don't do it all that often. Okay, good. So since nobody remembers it well enough to do it, then we're going to do it all over again until it's locked away. Now, what this is basically we get an understanding of how the Bible is organized, and then from that, we'll kind of be diving in. So we're going to take this big view of how the Bible is organized, okay? So this is going to require that you keep some semblance of a beat, okay? And we don't do a whole lot of rhythmic clapping during worship here, okay? So this might be challenging for everybody. I understand it, okay? There's no click in your ear or anything like that. But we're gonna keep a beat together, and then I'm gonna say some numbers, and then you're gonna repeat them after me, and we're gonna get this locked in your head because it's really a helpful tool I've found to understand where in the Bible are we and what's going on. Okay, so are you ready for the Sunday school Bible time clappy happy literary genre? I don't remember what it is. Okay, but let's do it. Okay, so we're gonna go like this. Okay. All right, here we go. 5, 12, 5, 5, 12. 5, 12, 5, 5, 12. 4, 1, 21, 1. 4, 1, 21, 1. All of it. 5, 12, 5, 5, 12. 4, 1, 21, 1. Let's dust on this last time. 5, 12, 5, 5, 12. 4, 1, 21, 1. Louder. Okay, that's enough of the Bible time clapping game. Okay, so what just happened is we've broken down the Bible together. So the Bible is not put together chronologically. Okay, if you're new to Christianity, if you've never read the Bible, if you pick the Bible up and you start reading in Genesis 1 and you want to get all the way through to Revelation, you might be like, what just happened? It'll be a good exercise, it'll be a helpful exercise, but it might be super confusing. So if you want to read the Bible from cover to cover, I highly recommend either downloading or finding a plan or just buying a chronological Bible. Okay? It is a Bible that is written in chronological order from a time perspective, and it chops up a lot of the books and puts them into place. Super helpful, okay? The Bible is actually broken up into different literary genres. That's why we were just clapping. Okay? So we have the first 5 books of the Bible, the 5, 12. So the first 5 books are, anyone? Right? Pentateuch. Okay, yeah. So the Pentateuch, the books of law, okay, the Torah. It was like Pentateuch. I was like, I don't know if there was sneezing or what. So we have the first 5 books of law. Okay, books of law are interpreted differently. Different levels of interpretation are applied to books of law. And then you have the 12 books of what are called historical narrative, okay? That's where we're going to find 1st and 2nd Samuel is it within historical narrative. Now, this does not mean, which you'll see in 1 Samuel 2, that there is not other literary forms found within the books, right? So in 1 Samuel 2, we have poetry, we have the prayer of Hannah. So, but it's by and large a long prose, a lot of storytelling, okay? So that's the 12, and then we have the 5 books of wisdom, then we have the 5 major prophets, and we have the 12 minor prophets, and that constitutes all of the Old Testament. Now, the major prophets and the minor prophets are not major and minor because of importance, it's just lengths of the books. Now, if you want to understand the chronology of the Old Testament, you would take the first 17 books, okay? You've got 5, and you've got 12, and then you've got 5, 5, and 12. So you take these 22 books, pick them up, and dump them into the first 17 if you want to understand the chronological order of the Old Testament. So as you're going through 1st and 2nd Samuel, you'll see a lot of references to Psalms, right? David authored a lot of the Psalms. If you're getting to Kings, you probably see a lot of Ecclesiastes and also some Proverbs from King Solomon. So a lot of this stuff, all of the prophets, everybody falls into, they're all dumped into the first 17. And then the New Testament, you have the 4 Gospels, you have 1 historical narrative, right, the book of Acts. So, and then you have 21 letters or epistles that are written to various churches or individuals, and then you have 1 final book of prophecy and revelation. So 5, 12, 5, 5, 12, 4, 1, 21, 1, all right? Just memorize it. Get it stuck in your head. And you'll be like, yeah, there's 39 books in the Old Testament. And you'll be able to realize that because you can do math. At least I can, because I went to Lewis Palmer High School. Shout out to the Rangers. Okay, so the Bible, this is kind of the overarching, this is the big picture of the Bible. 1st and 2nd Samuel are historical narrative, okay? And when we're going to get into this, right, when we get into the specifics of the chapters and everything, we've taught a class here about how to read and interpret and apply the Bible, okay? And where the genre comes in is within the correlation and the interpretation of the text. Because when you correlate and interpret the text incorrectly, or maybe not as correctly, right, it's not a black and white thing all the time, then you have poor application. And certainly the church has suffered for many, many, many decades from pastors and people applying the Bible in an incorrect and improper way. And it causes a lot of harm within the culture, especially in America, where we have a dominant kind of Christian culture, at least we have for the majority of our history. So that's kind of the big thing. The overarching theme of the Word in 1st and 2nd Samuel is certainly fit into this, is God is redeeming the world through his eternal love and affection. God is the author, God is the hero, God is the subject, God is the purpose, God is the means, and God is the end of this book. And we get into the application, I'm going to talk about why that becomes so important as we are especially getting into Old Testament narrative, because sometimes you can get sort of lost in the weeds in some of this stuff, but always remembering the big picture is important. Okay, so this book has these books, 1st and 2nd Samuel. By the way, they were in some ancient manuscripts. I believe it's the Hebrew Masoretic text has 1st and 2nd Samuel as kind of one book. Some of the ancient documents have from 1 Samuel 8 to the end of 2 Kings as one book, kind of the kings of Israel. The Greek Septuagint is the one that delineates between 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel. And so some translations of the Bible will lean more heavy on the Greek, some will lean more heavy on the Hebrew. You can really dive in and get super lost in all that, by the way. If you just want to go in and people there's fights over what interpretation of the Bible is best. And my answer to that, I've said it before, is what is the best translation of the Bible? There it is, the one you will read. Okay, that's the best translation of the Bible. So here at Alethia, we tend to go either NIV or ESV. One is dynamic equivalence, another one is a little bit more literal. But if you're not going to read it, it doesn't matter how correct you are, right? It doesn't really I have the ESV. If you read it, well, no, I just wanted to sound really smart, right? Like, no, that doesn't actually help. Okay, so within this book, or in these books, we're going to have 3 different subjects, okay? There are 3 kind of big people who are going to be showing up, okay? The first is Samuel, because it's called 1st and 2nd Samuel. Now, Samuel did not author 1st and 2nd Samuel. Why do we know that? Because in 1 Samuel 25, his death is recorded, and then there's a 2nd Samuel. So there you go, right? Like, that's a pretty easy one. We don't know who wrote it because God did not tell us explicitly, and through study, we haven't found anything that's been. It's probably actually a big group of people. A lot of these ancient Hebrew texts were passed down through the oral tradition and the oral history. And if you really want to do a fascinating study, it's how did these books get transcribed? How can we know that they are authentic and they are true? And it is amazingly powerful when you look at the seriousness that the Jewish people took with the ancient text. It's an awesome and fascinating study. So likely a group of people were kind of recording the history, and they called it 1st and 2nd Samuel because Samuel is a big character within these texts. He is the last judge of Israel. And so it's going to start 1 Samuel 1 through 1 Samuel 7. We don't really get into like the kingship over Israel. But so we're going to have Samuel, and we're going to have his sons, and we're going to also have Eli in the midst of that. And then we're going to transition into Saul. Okay, Saul becomes the first king of Israel. He's the second character that we're going to see kind of a preeminence. And there are other characters throughout this, right? So you're going to have you've got Hannah, who shows up right at the beginning and then kind of disappears. And then you have Saul, then you have his son Jonathan, right? The prince Jonathan, who then befriends David. It's this fascinating, like, long-term friendship, okay, between David and Jonathan. And then David becomes really the chief primary character that we're going to be interacting with, okay? David, there's a lot written about David. A lot is preached about David. David is probably more complex than you ever knew, right? David is a wildly complex character, and 1st and 2nd Samuel do not hide the complexity of David's character. And that's a good thing, right? I mean, if anybody wants to claim that like the Bible has been like whitewashed to only be like flowers and rainbows, it's not the case. Like, read through Judges and 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. God does not hide the humanity and the rawness of humanity from his people. And again, we'll kind of dig into this a little bit here in the application. So David is a king. David is a poet. He's a warrior. He's a shepherd. He is a horrendous sinner, right? He is an adulterer. Like, you look at David when he comes on and he starts talking about like the sons of David, and it lists like 11 sons with 11 different women. And I'm like, David was a lot Sean Kemp. Anyone get that joke? Anyone get that joke? Okay. David was a lot like Sean Kemp in that regard, right? David had a sincere and serious sin problem. Okay? So let's not forget the humanity of David, and yet God says that he's a man after my own heart. And so wrestling with that, there's going to be plenty of opportunity to wrestle through the humanity of David and ultimately the divinity of God in David's life. Specifically, as you get into 2 Samuel, right? 2 Samuel is prime. So 1 Samuel is kind of the wrestling and the transition between the period of the judges into Israel kind of demanding a king. And 2 Samuel is the building up of the Davidic covenant and kind of the messianic promise of God building his kingdom forever and ever through the kingship of David. So you're going to hear a lot and learn a lot, probably more than you ever want to know about David, right? Great friend, great king, horrible, horrible husband and father. His kids are a complete train wreck. They're killing one another. They're doing gross and horrible things with their stepsisters. It's just it is a gnarly story, right? And God says, I'm going to lay it all out there for you. This is my word, right? So don't shy away from this stuff. Okay, so the people of Israel, so that's kind of the who, right? So what's going on? The people of Israel are tired of being ruled by judges, and they demand a king. So for about 350 years, there are 15 different judges who judge and kind of rule over Israel. It begins with Othniel, we see him in Judges chapter 3, and then finally Samuel. Some people try to assert that Samuel appointed his kids, Joel and Abijah, I think. Anyway, was it? Abijah, there it is, sorry. I was trying to remember. So Joel, who anybody named Joel should never be appointed to be judge, first and foremost. Right? That's just prophet, yes, okay, but judge, no way. So he kind of tries to pass it on to them, but it's not going to work, right? And so really Samuel's kind of the last official judge of Israel, and then he's going to be sort of passing this thing over. And we see this here in 1 Samuel chapter 7, that the people of Israel want to be like the nations around them. They want to conform to the ways that everybody else is all around them. They don't want to be the people that God has called them to be, okay? There's also, within the context of this, we all know the story of like David and Goliath, right? And that's a pretty famous story from the Bible. And so the Philistines are here. The Philistines are an enemy of the Israelites, but they're not like a global superpower, okay? So don't think of the Philistines as like this big, overarching, dominating, like Babylonian empire type thing. They're a nuisance, okay? But right now, there's not really anybody who's like dominating the region during this time, okay? So yes, the Philistines are an enemy. Yes, Goliath is a big, giant dude. Yes, he gets killed, but the Philistines were not this like overbearing people. They were a people who were aggressive, and certainly the Israelites wanted a king to protect them from the Philistines. But kind of keep that in contrast. So think of 1 Samuel as kind of there's some X patterns going on, right? So we have the beginning of 1 Samuel. You sort of have the descendancy of Eli, who is the priest, and Eli's sons, who are described as very wicked. Okay, so you have this dissension of Eli coinciding with this rise of Samuel. Okay. And so Eli's kind of falling off, and Samuel's kind of coming up. And then the second half is you have Saul, who starts here, he's king, and then Saul falls off, and then David kind of rises. So that's kind of the way that 1 Samuel is going to sort of flow and go around. The book's going to begin with Hannah's prayer. She's recognized by Eli, and Eli's like, "What are you doing? Are you intoxicated? Are you drinking?" And she says, "No." And then there's this beautiful prayer, and at the beginning of this prayer, we're going to see a lot of promises that God will be fulfilling all throughout 1 and 2 Samuel. And then again, 2 Samuel is about the Davidic covenant and the foretelling of the Messianic promise. So it's taking place in Israel, okay, surrounding areas, around 1100 BC. So let's get into the why, and then we're going to get into some applications, okay? Because this is a lot of like heady sort of stuff, and I get it, and that's fine. And there's like, trust me, I'm exhausted as well. Okay, so why? Why is this all happening? Well, in Judges chapter 21, let's turn there. In Judges chapter 21, verse 25, right at the end of Judges. So it's going to go from Joshua, Judges, and then Ruth, and then 1 and 2 Samuel. So we have, in those days, Israel had no king, and everyone did as he saw fit. In those days, Israel had no king. Well, of course they didn't have a king, right? A human king. They had God as king, and it's kind of an ultimate insult to God, right? That the people of Israel ultimately demand a king other than Yahweh. So in those days, everyone did what was right in their own eyes. And let's be really honest, this is super familiar. If you take the context, the American context in which we live. Now, granted, there is an ancient context. This is not the exact same. But the principles are pretty close to the same. Amen? Right? Like, we live in a time, in a culture, in America, where we have no king. Right? America has no king. And everyone is pretty much doing whatever they want to do. right? Cultural relativism is at an all-time high, right? Like, everyone wants to say, like, there is nothing that is there's no absolutes in the world except for that statement is definitely absolute, which then gets super philosophically confusing, but that's a whole other conversation, right? But everyone is trying to do what's right in their own eyes. There is this whole movement of humanity, right? And that is basically saying, in America, which was similar to what's happening in Israel, different sort of ways that it manifests itself, but the same heart, which is, I want to do what I want to do, right? I want to be happy. I want to be content. I just want to make decisions that make me happy. And that is not the message of the cross. That is not the message of the church. It should never be the message of the church, right? You are not here to be made happy. So this is what's going on. So we can kind of relate a little bit to the Israelites, right? That we don't have a king, and everyone around us is just doing whatever they want to do, okay? Cultural relativism is happening. So everyone's doing what is right in their own eyes. And then we get over to 1 Samuel 12. So flip over to 1 Samuel chapter 12. We're going to be in verse 8 through 12. Okay. After Jacob entered Egypt, they cried to the Lord for help, and the Lord sent Moses and Aaron, who brought your forefathers out of Egypt and settled them in this place. But they forgot the Lord their God. This happens quite frequently with the Israelite people, right? Even during the time of the judges, that's why we have all these prophets. There's this like nature to them of like, yay, we love God. Like, you saved us, you did things for us. And they're like, what, God, who? And then they're down here and they forget God, and then bad things happen to them. And they're like, oh wait, no, we're going to come back to God. That's like basically the entire Old Testament survey. So you don't even need to take a class, you just have it. Okay, they forgot the Lord their God. So he sold them into the land of Sisera, the commander of the army of Hazor, into the hand of the Philistines, and the king of Moab, who fought against them. They cried out to the Lord and said, here's repentance. We have sinned. We have forsaken the Lord and served the Baals and the Ashtoreths. But now deliver us from the hands of our enemies, and we will serve you. The Lord sent Jerubbaal, Barak, Jephthah, and Samuel, and he delivered you from the hands of your enemies on every side, so that you lived securely. But when you saw that Nahash, king of the Ammonites, was moving against you, you said to me, no, we want a king to rule over us, even though the Lord your God was your king. So this is the crux, right? This is kind of this is the air that is being breathed here, okay? God's people are not trusting in the Lord. They're doing what they want to do. And when they go that way, when they build their own kingdoms, when they try to do things on their own, stuff goes poorly for them. And then they repent and they turn back to God, and then things start to go well, and they think, oh, look, things are going well. Why? Because we did it. It can't be from God. And then they start to go downhill, and the stuff starts to go poorly. So they basically slap Yahweh in the face, and they say to him, we want a human king to rule over us. Now, this is not as though God was like floored or like surprised by this whole thing, okay? So flip back a little bit to 1 Samuel chapter 8, verses 7 through 9. Actually, we'll start with 6. But when they said, give us a king to lead us, this displeased Samuel. So he prayed to the Lord, and the Lord told them, listen to what the people are saying to you. It is not you they have rejected, but they have rejected me as their king, as they have done from the day I brought them out of Egypt until this day, forsaking me and serving other gods. So they are doing to you. Now listen to them, but warn them solemnly, and let them know what the king who will reign over them will do. Okay? So Samuel is going to the Lord, right? The Lord's like, listen, I knew this was going to happen. Okay, if we go back into the Torah, so we'll leave the 12, we'll go back to the 5. In Deuteronomy chapter 17, excuse me. Man. All right, it's the altitude, I guess. Can I use that excuse yet, or do I still have it? Okay. Deuteronomy 17, 14 through 20. So this is part of Torah. Okay, this is God's law. So again, was God surprised? No, this is what he gives to Moses. When you enter the land the Lord your God has given you, and have taken possession of it, and settled in it, and you say, let us set a king over us like all the nations around us. Huh. It's almost like God knows things about stuff. Be sure to appoint over you the king the Lord your God chooses. So what do? They don't really wait for, I mean, God says, hey, listen to the people, right? But you'll see a lot of problems, and Israel will pay for the problems by not following the commandments that God gives to them. He must be from among your own brothers. Do not place a foreigner over you, one who is not a brother Israelite. The king, moreover, must not acquire great numbers of horses for himself, or make the people return to Egypt to get more of them. For the Lord has told you, you are not to go back that way again. He must not take many wives. Well, that's going to become a big problem, right? There is a lot of problems that come from just that one thing, right? Like, that one command that God's like, don't take a lot of wives. And David's like, did you say take a lot of wives? Okay. He's like, no, I said don't take a lot of wives. And then Solomon was like, I'll take a lot of wives. And God's like, no, do not take many wives. There will be problems, or his heart will be led astray. He must not accumulate large amounts of silver and gold. So again, God is not surprised by the fact that the people ultimately demand to have a king, right? God knew this was going to happen. We will see the sovereignty of God on display throughout 1st and 2nd Samuel, right? You will see God as the sovereign Lord over the people, and you will see a lot of grace in the story as well, right? Some people, I've heard it said, like, the Old Testament God is this God of, like, judgment and vengeance, but the New Testament God is, like, hippie God, who's all about love and acceptance. And I'm like, no, God is the same yesterday, today, and forever, right? So you will see the grace and the goodness and the love and the beauty of God through his interactions with a rebellious people all throughout this story. So here are some things to watch for and some things to take away. Number one, God is the ultimate hero, okay? God is the ultimate hero. This is a book about heroic acts, and we have a tendency as Americans to read ourselves in to the hero part of the story, right? Like Jerry Seinfeld said in his, I don't remember when his stand-up act was, 98, 99, something like that. He said for little boys growing up, we don't see superheroes as fantasies. We look at them as career options, right? Like, no, I think I could be Batman. Yeah, I could do that, right? Like, we have a tendency to want to read ourselves in as the hero of the story. That is not going to be the case, okay? God and Jesus are the ultimate heroes. It's not about you. This book is not about you. You are not in it. This book is written about real people. It's not mythology. Okay, it's not some made-up, fanciful story. Okay, Josephus, amongst many other historians, validate the claims of the Bible, and specifically a lot of the ancient texts. Okay, this book and these books are about real people at a real place in a real time. So really get to know them, right? Really get to study them and dive into it. You can study it on your own. You don't have to wait for the person to come up and preach. You can actually study it, right? Like, you have the internet. Guys, you have the internet, but also be careful, because you have the internet. So they're not about you, you're not in it. So here's what I want you to do. When you read parts in this book, read parts in the book that contain kind of glory and victory, right? Like David and Goliath. Don't ask like, hey, how can I be the hero? How can I be heroic? Instead say, where do I see Jesus? Where is Christ in this? Because ultimately, Christ is the hero of the Bible, not you. I'll say it again. You are not the hero of the Bible. But you will see a lot of stories of human failure, right? And you'll see a lot of stories of gross, disgusting human failure that God leaves in there. And in this, I want you to ask, where do I see myself? Right? Where do I see my flesh? Because God is the hero, but ultimately our sin is the thing that causes and creates that separation. And it's that sin that we can wrestle with. It's that sin that in our humility we can die in, we can look at and we can repent from, right? It is the sin that causes consequences. And so we can say, where do I see myself? And what happens when we do this, when we approach the text in this way, is that we make much of God and Christ in us for the Christian, and it helps keeps us humble, right? Like, oh man, that could be me. Like, I have the propensity inside of me to do that kind of stuff. The depths of human depravity begin in the depths of our wicked hearts. And they're bent towards destruction and selfishness and pride, right? Like Paul says in Romans 7, like, what a wretched man am I. The things that I don't want to do, I do, and the things that I ought to do, I don't do. It's very confusing, and I think a lot of us can really relate to that. 1st and 2nd Samuel ultimately are very relatable if we're allowing ourselves to relate into the passage, okay? So God is the ultimate hero, okay? And let's make much of the Lord through this. The second thing is this. This book is ultimately about 2 kingdoms, okay? Or these books, 1st and 2nd Samuel, are about 2 kingdoms, okay? One is the establishment of a human reign and a human kingdom. And God, not being surprised by this, says, okay, but if you want to rule, then try to rule in this way. And nobody can actually do it. No human being can do it, right? Which again, God will show throughout all of time until he brings on the scene King Jesus, who can fulfill and show us what does a king really look like. So you have man's kingdom, our little kingdoms that we're all trying to build up, right? That we don't want to have God to be king over us. We want to be king of our own little dominion. We want to set our own little rules. We want to do our own little thing. Okay? That will ultimately lead to destruction. It's not going to work out well for you. Newsflash. Okay? Spoiler alert. It's a bad idea to try to build up your own little mini kingdoms, because ultimately you have to come face to face with the other kingdom, which is God's kingdom. The eternal preeminence of God's kingdom. Okay? And when those two things clash, there's only one that ultimately wins out. So as people are building up their own little kingdoms, right, cultural relativism at its finest, we're going to see through the stories what's going to happen there. But building up and participating in God's kingdom is hard. It is not necessarily an easy thing. I can tell you that right now. Right now, in the middle of our life, participating in the kingdom of God and saying, King Jesus, what do you have for me? It sounds like a nice, easy thing to talk about. It's a really scary prayer, because ultimately we want control, right? Don't we? Don't we as human beings want to ultimately control our own destiny, right? Like, we want to be the ones who can do what we want to do. And when we start to actually follow after the Bible, right, we start to die to ourselves, we start to take up our cross, we start to say to the Lord, Lord, not my will, but yours be done. And he goes, do you mean it? And you're like, yeah. And then he'll go, okay, this is what I want you to do. And you're like, no, not that. And then, right, like, it's hard. It's difficult, right? This world that is not our home is a tough place. And God's saying, I'm establishing my kingdom here, and I'm looking for people to work with me in establishing my kingdom here. But that does not mean it is easy work. It is difficult. It is hard. We want to do what's right in our own hearts. But in this new covenant that we are living in with Christ, we are told to be different. We're told to be crucified with Jesus. We are told to confess with our mouth, Jesus is Lord. Right? So, throughout this time, are you going to be willing to pray that? Are you going to be willing to look at that? Are you going to be willing to ask the difficult questions? And finally, the final point of 1st and 2nd Samuel is ultimately the final point of every single book of the Bible, and it's this. God is relentlessly, passionately, and lovingly pursuing his people. Always. God will never, ever, ever give up on you, regardless of what you've done, right? He will keep pursuing you here on earth, right? Story after story after story in the text is human failure, death, destruction, right? Gross, horrible, incestual types of sins that are happening within the text, and God keeps on pursuing. God never gives up. Right? He keeps on coming. No matter how far you think you can run or what kind of bad stuff that you might have done, God will never, ever stop loving you. And you are never so far out of his reach that you cannot be touched by the love and the mercy of God. You're going to be looking at David, right? You're going to be looking at David as this king, who is by all accounts a great king of Israel, right? And then you see how he governs, right? King David versus personal David. And you're going to see a lot of stories, right? Especially when you start getting into the lives of David's kids and just how atrociously awful David was as a father. And I think you'll see hope. I think you'll see grace. And ultimately, you'll see Jesus, who is the author and the perfecter of our faith. And that's the goal, right? The goal is not to study a book of the Bible and get information, right? Knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. That's not the goal of Bible study, right? That's not the goal of coming to church, is to be a really smart Christian who just knows a lot of stuff about the Bible, right? The goal of the Bible is knowing much of Jesus, exalting Christ, making him known, okay? And then allowing the love of God, right? Encountering and loving God, allowing the love of God through the truth of his word to permeate and penetrate your life in such a way that you can go embrace people and ultimately serve the world and participate in the building up of God's kingdom and not your own. So I'm going to have the worship team come up, and we're gonna pray here. Heavenly Father, Lord, you say that it's in our weakness that you're made strong, Lord. And I know for myself, and for so many people here, we have very real weaknesses, Lord. We'll be able to really relate in a very real way to the people here in these stories that you have not hid. Lord, it's crazy to me that you did not hide these stories, but rather you just let it all be laid bare, Lord, so that we can see, ultimately, we can get a taste of your grace and your goodness and your mercy, and we can see that you always have done that and that you always will do that, Lord. And there's hope in that, and I thank you for the hope. I thank you for the hope and the goodness of the gospel. That is good news for a weary and tired world, who at some point in time all just have to be so exhausted from their own little kingdom building, Lord. May those kingdoms fall, and may your kingdom reign. May your kingdom come, and your will be done on earth as it is in heaven, Lord. Thank you for this day. Thank you for our daily bread. Thank you for Jesus and for the forgiveness of our sins.